The mall was a blur of flashing lights, sales signs, and the constant murmur of shoppers drifting between stores. The food court was packed, the sound of laughter and clinking trays mixing with the buzz of conversation. At a table near the back of the food court, a group of teens sat, sprawled across their chairs, phones out, barely glancing up as the world moved around them. They were loud, careless, and made no effort to blend in with the crowd. People like them never did. But it wasn't the teens that caught everyone's attention first. It was the old man walking slowly through the mall, his weathered hand gripping the armrest of his wheelchair. Tom Mason was 62, but the years weighed heavy on him. He wore his Vietnam veteran cap with pride, his jacket a little worn at the edges, but carrying the weight of stories far heavier than the clothes he wore. Tom had come to the mall for one simple reason: to pick up a new pair of shoes. He wasn't looking for anything special, just some comfort for the long walks around the neighborhood he had made his home. He didn't ask for attention, didn't want it. He had lived through things that most people could never imagine, and he had learned that sometimes the best way to move through life was with a quiet dignity. But today, quiet dignity was about to be tested. As he passed the food court, the group of teens at the table noticed him immediately. It wasn't hard to see why. The old man, in his faded jacket and slow pace, was the perfect target for their boredom. The boys whispered to each other, their eyes gleaming with that familiar look of disrespect they had practiced too many times before. They were young and stupid, with no understanding of the weight of what they mocked. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. One of the boys, a lanky teen with a tattoo poking out from under his sleeve, raised his voice just enough for Tom to hear. "Hey, Grandpa, you need help getting to the retirement home?" The girl next to him, wearing a crop top and a smirk, joined in, mocking his limp, mimicking his movements as she twisted her body in a ridiculous parody. "Watch out, old man. You gonna fall down? Better use that wheelchair before you break a hip." The third boy snickered, clearly enjoying the scene as he leaned back in his chair, smirking. "What's with the army jacket, huh? Shouldn't you be in a museum or something?" Tom's eyes flickered toward them, but he didn't stop. His grip on the wheelchair tightened, but his expression remained calm, his face unreadable. He didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. But inside, something twisted. He had lived through wars, lost friends, and buried too many memories. But this felt different. The teens laughed louder, pushing each other as they egged one another on. One of the boys stood, waltzing over to Tom, who was still making his way past the table, trying to ignore them. "You're a real piece of work, old man. Shouldn't you be at home knitting socks or something? How's that wheelchair feel, huh?" That was it. Tom stopped in his tracks. The air seemed to freeze, the noise of the mall fading to nothing but the sound of his heartbeat. He turned slowly to face the boy, who was standing in front of him, blocking his way. Tom's eyes were hard, like steel, his hands still gripping the chair. He was done pretending not to hear the disrespect. For a long moment, there was only silence. The boy, unsure whether he had gone too far, smirked nervously, waiting for a response. But Tom didn't speak right away. Instead, he simply met the boy's gaze with a look that spoke louder than any words could. Then, just as the boy opened his mouth to taunt him again, a voice rang out, loud, clear, and full of authority. "What do you think you're doing?" It was Officer Lisa Carson, walking through the food court, her eyes scanning the crowd for trouble, as she had done countless times before. She had seen more than her fair share of disrespect in the mall, but this time it felt different. This time, it was personal. She was no stranger to conflict, but she also knew how to handle situations without escalation. What caught her attention, however, wasn't just the behavior of the teens. It was the way the veteran stood there, unmoved by their taunts, and the way he refused to engage with them. There was something in his stance, something proud, dignified, and it called out to her. Lisa stepped closer, her boots clicking with purpose as she approached the group. Her uniform was crisp, her stance confident, and her presence demanded attention. The teens looked up at her, startled, their expressions changing in an instant. "What's going on here?" she asked, her eyes scanning the group. The boy, still standing in front of Tom, tried to shrug it off, but there was no denying the discomfort now seeping into his bravado. We were just joking around, officer." "Joking?" Lisa's voice cut through the tension, her tone even but unmistakably firm. "You think mocking a man because of his service is funny?" The boy faltered, his words getting stuck in his throat. Lisa didn't wait for an answer. "You kids don't know the first thing about respect. Maybe it's time you learned." Her words were sharp, her eyes narrowed as she turned to look at Tom. And in that moment, the entire food court seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his reaction. Tom didn't speak, but the way he stood there, his shoulders straight and his gaze steady, made it clear he wasn't going to back down. Lisa didn't miss it. She turned back to the teens, her gaze hardening. "You don't get to treat someone like that. Not here, not in my mall." The teens, clearly out of their depth now, shifted uncomfortably. They had been expecting to be able to walk away from the situation, to laugh it off, to keep the upper hand. But now, they were facing something entirely different. A police officer who wouldn't let them get away with their disrespect. Lisa took another step forward, standing between Tom and the group, a physical barrier between their disrespect and his dignity. "You want to joke around? Fine, but you're going to do it somewhere else. And you'll be lucky if I don't have you banned from this mall for the way you've treated him." The teens didn't say another word. One by one, their shoulders slumped in defeat, and they walked away. The once confident group now broken by the reality of what had just transpired. Tom let out a small, quiet sigh of relief, his fingers loosening their grip on the armrests of his chair. Lisa turned to him, offering a nod. "You okay, sir?" Tom's voice was steady, but his words had weight. "I've been through worse, but it's nice to see someone stand up for us once in a while." Her gaze softened. "It's the least I could do." The mall returned to its usual rhythm, but the lesson had been learned. The respect that had been earned through years of sacrifice wasn't something you mocked, and the officer, the veteran, and the moment of confrontation left everyone in the food court with something to think about. Respect wasn't always easy to give, but when it was earned, it demanded to be shown. The teens walked away, their heads down, but their footsteps faltering as they retreated from the scene. The crowd around them began to murmur, some shaking their heads, others still staring, as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. It wasn't every day that someone stood up to teenagers in the middle of a crowded mall, especially not when they were mocking a veteran. The food court returned to its usual din, clattering trays, the chatter of customers, the occasional laughter echoing in the corners. But for a moment, the air felt different. It was thicker, charged with something that had been missing in the space before. It was respect, earned and given, in the most unexpected of circumstances. Tom sat still, his hands resting on the armrests of his wheelchair, his back straight as ever. His eyes tracked the teens as they walked toward the exit, but there was no sign of triumph in his gaze, just a quiet, steady resolve. He wasn't a man who needed to bask in victory. He was a man who had fought for what he believed in ways that most people would never understand. But today, he had witnessed something he hadn't in a long time, a moment when justice had been swift and real respect had been shown. Lisa stood next to him now, her gaze softening as she watched the teens leave. She could feel the weight of the moment. The tension had passed, but there was still something in the air, a shift. "You didn't have to do that," Tom said, his voice low but carrying a quiet sincerity. "They were just kids after all." Lisa looked down at him, her expression softening further. "Someone had to," she said, her tone firm yet empathetic. "You shouldn't have to put up with that kind of disrespect. No one should." Tom chuckled softly, the sound rough but genuine. "You'd be surprised how often it happens. People forget sometimes what it means to honor the ones who've served." "Some people," Lisa said, her voice tightening slightly, "forget a lot of things." She glanced at the door where the teens had disappeared, a flash of anger creeping in, but she quickly brushed it away. Her eyes returned to Tom. "But not everyone. Not everyone forgets." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the food court settling around them. It was a strange kind of peace, the kind that came from knowing that, for once, justice had been served without hesitation. There was something humbling about that, something that made Lisa realize just how much she wanted to see more of it. In her line of work, it was easy to get jaded, easy to fall into a routine of dealing with petty crimes and misunderstandings. But this was different. This was about something bigger. This was about respect for people who had given so much and asked for so little in return. "You know," she said, her voice thoughtful, "it's rare. People don't stand up like that for each other anymore. At least, not in the way you'd expect. Tom nodded, his face creased with age but still resolute. Some things are harder to notice, kid. People get used to the way things are. They forget what it takes to keep things right. Lisa turned to face him fully now, her expression serious, her jaw set in determination. I don't forget. Tom studied her for a moment, his gaze intense before giving a slow nod. I think you're one of the good ones, kid. The words landed on Lisa like a weight she hadn't expected. She felt something stir inside her, a sense of validation, a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't about the badge or the uniform. It was about the people, the way they looked at her when she did the right thing. It was about moments like this, where doing the right thing meant more than enforcing the law. It meant honoring what came before. Tom shifted in his chair, letting out a soft sigh as he finally pushed himself away from the table. Well, I guess I've made my point. Time for me to get my shoes before I'm forced to listen to more of these kids' nonsense. Lisa smiled at that, a small, understanding smile. You want me to help? Tom shook his head. No, I'm good. Just needed to make sure I wasn't getting in your way. Lisa shook her head. It's my job to make sure people aren't getting in anyone's way. She gave him a parting nod as Tom wheeled himself toward the store he had originally set out to visit. He moved with the same slow, deliberate pace, not in a rush, not in a hurry. But as he passed by a group of teenagers, he caught one of them looking at him. The kid's eyes were wide, and he quickly looked away when he noticed Tom's gaze on him. Tom didn't need to say anything. He just kept moving, knowing that the look had meant something. It wasn't fear, it was understanding. Lisa stood at the edge of the food court, watching Tom go, but there was a sense of contentment settling over her. She had done the right thing today, and maybe, just maybe, she had made a difference. The mall, for all its noise and chaos, had become something else for a brief moment. It had become a place where honor and respect weren't just words on a sign or something you read about in the papers. It had become a place where they were earned, where people stood up for each other when it mattered most. As Tom disappeared into the store, Lisa felt a quiet warmth spread through her chest. It was a reminder that in a world that often felt too busy, too distracted, the smallest acts of kindness, the kind that come from standing up for others, even when they can't stand for themselves, were the ones that lasted. And maybe that's what the world needed more of. Maybe that's what we all needed. The air in the mall had settled back into its usual rhythm, but there was a change in the way people moved through the space. A few quiet conversations bubbled up, murmurs of the incident still fresh on the lips of some. But now there was a newfound sense of respect, something intangible, something earned. The tone of the mall had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that made everything feel just a little more connected. Lisa stood near the edge of the food court, watching Tom disappear into the shoe store. She could still hear the faint clatter of his wheelchair as it rolled across the tile, the rhythm of his movement steady and sure, despite the mockery he'd endured. It wasn't just the fact that she had stepped in and stopped the teens. It was the fact that he hadn't needed her to. He had been ready to walk away from the whole thing, not letting their words get to him. But there was something in the way he had paused when they had pushed too far. Something in the way his silence had spoken louder than their insults. It made Lisa realize just how much of his life had been spent swallowing insults, avoiding confrontation. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. She couldn't let it linger for too long, or she'd lose her focus. She was still on duty, still had a job to do. But just as she was about to turn, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Hey, Officer Carson." It was one of the mall's regulars, an older man who owned a small electronics shop near the back of the food court. He waved as he approached, his hands full of paperwork. Lisa couldn't help but smile. John Mitchell was the kind of guy who had a habit of talking your ear off, but he was harmless, and she liked him. "What's up, Mr. Mitchell?" she asked, ready for another one of his long-winded stories. He waved his papers in the air. "You won't believe it. I saw what happened with that group of kids, those punks messing with that old vet. It was unbelievable." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You didn't get involved, did you?" He waved off her concern. "Nah, I'm too old for that. But, I had to come over here to say something. I was watching it go down, and I've got to tell you, you did good. I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in, but I saw those kids looking like they were about to do a lot worse than mock the guy." Lisa nodded, her thoughts drifting back to Tom. She had acted quickly, instinctively, but now, hearing someone else talk about it, it felt different. She had done her job, sure, but there was something in the way John said it that made her pause. She hadn't realized how bad it had gotten, how much of a breaking point they were pushing for. She had always thought of herself as someone who intervened when things went south, but today had reminded her that it wasn't just about stopping the bad from happening. It was about making sure the good didn't go unnoticed. "Yeah, well," Lisa said, her voice softer now. "I think they learned their lesson." She paused, then added, "I just don't know how many more lessons like that are going to be needed." John didn't seem to hear the question in her voice. "You can say that again. You know, I saw that vet roll past my shop earlier, and I had no idea. I see him around now and then, but I didn't realize—" His words trailed off, as if the weight of his own realization was too heavy to continue. Lisa glanced over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she saw Tom emerging from the shoe store. He was moving slowly, the bag of shoes in his lap. But there was something different in the way he carried himself now, a certain pride in his posture. John must have noticed it too, because he suddenly stepped closer to Lisa, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know, not many people would have stood up for that guy like you did. These kids, they don't know what they're dealing with." Lisa didn't answer right away. She just watched Tom, watching him blend back into the crowd. There was no celebration, no moment of recognition. He didn't need it. The attention of the mall had already shifted back to the usual hum of life. But for the people who had witnessed it, for the people who had seen the shift in the air when the officer had stepped in to defend someone who had earned his respect, things weren't the same. Not anymore. "You know," John continued, pulling Lisa from her thoughts, "I don't think those kids will forget it. And if they do, I'll make sure they hear about it. They should know who that guy is, what he's done." Lisa gave him a tight smile, her mind still swirling with what had just happened. It was all too easy to dismiss something like this. Too easy to let things slide, to ignore the small acts of disrespect that piled up over time, until they became something too big to handle. But this had been different. "I'm sure they'll remember," she said, her voice firm now. "And if they don't, well, we'll make sure the next time they try something like that, they think twice." Tom had made his way to the door, ready to leave, and Lisa watched him go, his silhouette framed by the glass doors. He had been through so much in his life, and yet, it had taken just one moment of courage for him to stand tall again. She didn't know what his life had looked like, what battles he had faced, both in the past and in the present. But she knew that his quiet dignity had spoken volumes. It had taken more than words to silence those teens. It had taken a lesson in respect. Lisa finally turned to John, her posture straight, her shoulders relaxed. "I'm heading out too. Keep an eye out for anything else today." John gave a nod, still looking thoughtful. "You got it, officer, and thanks again." Lisa smiled, her hand brushing against the radio on her belt as she walked toward the door. She could hear the buzz of the mall around her, the noise of the world continuing without missing a beat. But inside her, something felt different. Today she hadn't just done her job, she had made sure the world hadn't forgotten what respect really meant. And as she stepped out into the cool air, watching Tom's silhouette grow smaller with each passing step, she couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, she had done something worth remembering. The quiet hum of the mall's air conditioning was a welcome relief after the tension that had hung in the food court moments ago. Lisa Carson walked toward her patrol car, her boots tapping rhythmically against the concrete floor. The noise of the mall receded behind her, replaced by the sound of the world outside, the rumble of passing cars, the occasional shout of children playing near the fountains, and the rustling of leaves in the wind. She reached her car, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat. For a moment, she sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead. The events of the afternoon kept replaying in her mind. Tom Mason's calm yet firm presence, the way he had handled the disrespect with such quiet dignity, the way his silence had spoken volumes. She thought about how, in that brief encounter, so much had shifted, not just for the teens, but for everyone who had witnessed it. It wasn't every day that a police officer stood up not just for the law, but for the kind of respect that should be automatic. And it had been so easy to let those teens get away with it, to turn a blind eye, but she hadn't. She had acted, and it had felt like the right thing to do. Lisa shook her head and sighed. The world didn't always offer moments like that. Most of the time, she dealt with the same petty crimes, the same arguments between teenagers, the same shoplifters who thought they could get away with it. But this felt different. It felt like a turning point. She put the car in gear and drove out of the parking lot, heading toward the quieter side of town. There was still some time left in her shift, but the weight of what had happened sat heavily on her shoulders. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was supposed to be the one enforcing respect, but today, it had been Tom Mason who had shown her what real respect looked like. Lisa's phone buzzed as she neared a stoplight. She picked it up, glancing down at the screen. It was a message from her partner, Jake. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. Yo, you good? Just saw the news. The whole mall's talking about what happened with the teens. People are saying you crushed it. Talk later." She smiled softly, shaking her head. Jake always had a way of making everything sound more dramatic than it was, but she didn't mind. She typed back quickly. "Yeah, I'm good. Just needed a moment. Talk later." She hit send and tossed the phone on the passenger seat. But as she drove, the words from her message felt heavier than they should. She'd never been one to want praise, but what Tom had done, it was something worth recognizing. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the city streets. The familiar hum of traffic, the soft rhythm of her car's engine, the quiet passing of time, it all felt strangely calming, like the world was moving on. But she was still caught in that moment at the mall, still processing the way the events had unfolded. The teens, the officer, Tom. Lisa drove past the small neighborhood park, where kids were running and laughing, their voices cutting through the air. She slowed down and glanced over to see a mother pushing her child in a stroller. The world kept going, but the questions about how things had played out today still lingered. Did those kids really learn their lesson? Or would they forget by the time they reached the next corner of the mall? Would they just laugh it off, chalking it up to a weird encounter with an officer who had nothing better to do? She couldn't stop herself from wondering whether that brief moment had made a real difference. And then she thought about Tom again, the way he had stood tall in the face of their mockery, not because he had to, but because he knew that standing up for himself meant something bigger than pride. Maybe the lesson wasn't for the teens. Maybe it was for people like her, people who forgot what it was like to remember who had fought for the freedom to mock, to be silly, to laugh and joke with their friends without thinking about the cost. Lisa had seen veterans before, of course. She'd seen the wounded ones, the ones who walked slowly, the ones who carried their service in their eyes. But Tom had carried something else, something that wasn't just in his heart, but in his bones, the pride of someone who had walked into hell and survived. She turned the corner and pulled into the small lot near her apartment. The sun was low now, the golden light spilling through the trees, casting an almost ethereal glow over everything. For the first time in a while, the weight she carried didn't feel as heavy. It was as if she had finally seen the world with a clearer vision. Her role wasn't just to catch the bad guys, it was to protect the things that mattered. She parked the car and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel. The sound of the engine ticking off slowly as it cooled was the only noise around her. And then, without realizing it, she smiled. The world had its flaws, people had flaws, but there were moments like today, where she could see something better in it. Something that felt like it might just be enough to keep pushing forward. Maybe, just maybe, people could learn from this. From Tom Mason, from his quiet strength, his humility. Maybe the teens had learned something after all. Lisa stepped out of the car, the cool evening air hitting her skin, a sharp contrast to the warmth in her chest. She walked toward the apartment, feeling a quiet sense of peace she hadn't expected. She was still the officer, still the one who would stand in the face of trouble. But today she had learned that sometimes you don't need to chase after the trouble to do the right thing. Sometimes you just need to stand still and let people see you do it. And for once, she was okay with that.